view that is contrary to theirs is deemed illegal and punishable. A case in point is the recent I Want to Touch a Dog event organized by a social activist in Selangor. The religious authorities took such offense to the notion of Muslims touching dogs that they initiated investigations against the organizer for allegedly promoting liberalism and pluralism. Meanwhile, the National Fatwa Council quickly decreed that touching dogs is against Islam, or at least the state-approved version of the religion. This ruling is not only patronizing towards Muslims, it also ignores the diverse range of scholarly opinions on this matter. The Maliki school of thought, for example, takes a different stand with regard to dogs compared to the Shafi'i doctrine. So clearly we are headed towards a very exclusivist, parochial form of Islam. And such an approach is not only divisive, it is also against our very own cultural traditions. Having always been a plural society, Islamic practice in Malaysia, in the region generally, has been accommodative of the colorful variety of Islamic traditions without holding fanatically to any one particular view. For example, the established practice of paying the zakat fitrah in this country is more in line with the Hanafi school of thought, even though the government claims to follow Imam Shafi'i. So in truth, this obsession with ensuring conformity and punishing those who are different has little to do with religion. Dogs have coexisted with Malaysians forever, but somehow a fatwa is needed today. The same goes for Malay Bibles and the use of the word Allah. These are not new or recent innovations, but yet after 57 years of accepting these practices, the government suddenly has a change of heart. Now, if only the religious authorities were as diligent and uncompromising on corruption and abuse of power. Would it not serve the greater good if a fatwa declared that Muslims were not allowed to touch money from ill-gotten gains? I think that would be more useful. But unfortunately, it is clear that an idea is only deemed a threat if it challenges the authorities' ideological monopoly. Hence, in the eyes of the state, diversity is a danger while conformity is a virtue. This sudden extremist stance by the government actually stems from political insecurity. With their mandate severely reduced and their dominance challenged, the government has reacted by exerting stronger grip on religious institutions in order to legitimize their own moral authority. So it does not matter to them if their actions are actually belittling not only centuries of Islamic civilizational knowledge, but also the very mental faculties that God has granted humans. And neither do they care if they are being inconsistent with their own rules. For example, the National Fatwa Council has forbidden the smoking of cigarettes and shisha by Muslims. Yet somehow there's never been any political will to ensure this ruling is actually observed. So it is therefore obvious that the enforcement of religion in this country is selective and politically motivated. How else would one explain that certain books are banned in the Malay language on grounds that it contravenes the teachings of the Ahli Sunnah wal Jama'ah, yet remain freely available in English? It is nothing less than an insult to Malaysians, and the Malays in particular. This hypocrisy is now extended to the values associated with liberalism, pluralism, and secularism. 50 years ago, these were choice characteristics espoused by our national leaders as our country's aspirations. Unfortunately, because the government now views societal freedom and collective enlightenment as a threat to their stranglehold on power, these same terms have now been demonized as Western inventions designed to divide the Ummah. And so in these foreboding times, a strong collective response is needed, lest our country succumbs to the extremist whims of the powers that be. Over the last 30 years, we have seen how in the hands of an unrivaled authoritarian government, our public institutions have been emasculated and our constitution amended in many ways that may never be undone. And if we do not stand up to those now using religion to suppress dissent and solidify their power, Malaysia may never be able to reclaim its identity as a moderate, peaceful, and pluralistic nation. So in this light, I think the recent open letter, was it yesterday, that was published by 25 distinguished, prominent Malays, calling upon moderate Malaysians to speak up and reject the growing extremist, immoderate and intolerant voices is most welcome. However, as many commentators have also pointed out, 25 people, no matter how prominent they are, is not nearly enough. It all depends on the rest of us to do something as well. So the first step has been taken. The ball is in our court. So I wish you all thank you, and thank you for coming to this lecture by most esteemed Professor Ibrahim Musa, I'm sure, who will speak more on this very pressing issue. Wish you all a good forum ahead. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, YB Zairiel. To further proceed, I would like to now invite our moderator of the day, Dr. Ahmad Farooq Musa, for his speech.
Testing. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me over here. I'm always happy to be in Penang. It's my hometown. So I always take the opportunity to come back to Penang whenever there is a possibility. And today we have with us, thank you Zarel for organizing this event as well. And we have with us a very prominent Professor of Islamic Studies, Professor Ibrahim Musa from Notre Dame University. He was previously at Duke University, and he was a South African native, right? Yeah, but now, of course, staying in the American, right? This is not a very easy topic, right? Especially talking about pluralism. And as you know, this term, pluralism, is basically a dirty word in our community. Just like liberalism, just like human rights, just like democracy, and many other things as well. Especially pluralism. And if you were in KL, you would have noticed that Jakim incessantly, every Friday, will talk about about pluralism, the danger of pluralism in Friday prayer, right? And when I arranged Professor Ibrahim Musa to present his khutbah, Friday sermon at ISTAC. ISTAC is International Islamic Institute for Civilization and Thought. It's a subsidiary of IIUM. Initially they agreed, but then of course they revoked. And then I wanted to take him to deliver a Friday sermon at my previous place where I work, the National Heart Institute. I took Professor Tariq Ramadan in 2012 to deliver a sermon over there. But this time around, they refused Professor Ibrahim Musa as well. So can you imagine the problem that we're facing nowadays, right? So they're scared of this modernist view, this how do I say, these intellectual views with regard to modern issues, right? Like pluralism, like secularism, like liberalism, and so on and so forth. For all of you who have read this Tariq Ramadan's book, A Quest for Meaning, you know that it's not an easy book to understand and to comprehend, right? But it's a very good book about pluralism, about the philosophy of pluralism. And I think without much ado, I would like to invite upon Professor Ibrahim Musa to deliver his talk on this interesting topic. Prof.
Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, and Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm absolutely delighted to be in Malaysia once again. And I want to thank all the organizers, especially the Islamic Renaissance Front, the Penang Institute, Khairul Johari and Dr. Ahmad Farooq Musa for inviting me, for the warm reception that the staff and support people have been providing me during my stay out here. I hope that ideas are not the dangerous thing in Malaysia, because today I'm going to talk about ideas. I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't already know. So if anybody's taking detailed notes, this should be the opening line, that I am not saying anything new. Most of the things that I'm saying is things that you know. Developing a philosophy of pluralism. I'm not a political theorist. I'm a scholar of religion. My expertise is Islamic theology. But I try and think about the issues of the world in a much more complex and global way. Recently I've been reading the Polish thinker who died about a year or 2 years ago, Leszek Kolakowski, and I was struck by a very important quotation by Leszek Kolakowski, and while reading it I was wondering whether the picture that many liberals have and have been painting about liberalism have not missed something. Perfection of the secular must be intrinsic and in some measure incurable. Culture, when it loses its sacred sense, loses all sense. With the disappearance of the sacred, which imposes limits to the perfection that could be attained by the profane, arises one of the most dangerous illusions of our civilization. The illusion that there are no limits to the changes that human life can undergo, that society is in principle an endlessly flexible thing, and that to deny the flexibility and this perfectibility of society is to deny man's total autonomy, and thus to deny man himself. I'm particularly interested in this quote because in some senses this quote is talking about the question of the sacred in society, and at how the sacred, or what people call tradition, actually owns us. So one of the big problems that liberalism faces here, or modernity faces, is that what is the alternative that modernity provides? What is the alternative that liberalism gives, that tradition or religion or the sacred already provides? Clearly, one of the big problems that we find is that tradition and religion often is not understood to be something that develops over time. So people think that the most authentic of religion is the first instantiation, and that pattern or that practice is the only practice. But at the same time, what many of us moderns ought not to do is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that is not to throw out the sacred, as religion also adapts and becomes and evolves over time. So in some of our discussions about pluralism, there has been a back and forth about the place of the sacred, the place of religion. We ask whether we eradicate the sacred if one religion is privileged over the other. If one religion is privileged over the other, we must ask the question, have we not eradicated the sacred? Because the sacred in itself asks that the plurality of faiths is seen as part of the manifestation of the divine. In Islam it is very clear that Muslims don't see Islam as a new religion, but sees Islam as a continuation of the previous religions. It's a continuation of at least the Abrahamic faith, because it believes to that sister or that family of religions. But the other religions are in the world, and therefore the Quran says in other places, for instance, that those who believe in God and in accountability in the last day, that they have nothing to fear and they have nothing to grieve. The Quran also says that Muslims must not judge other people and leave it to God to judge the way they live their lives. And so a very important question that the idea of pluralism entrenches is to maintain the plurality of the sacred, not the singularity of the sacred. that the sacred comes in different pictures and different images. One of the interesting things in Kolakowski's sensibility here that I quote that I gave you is that the idea of the sacred helps us towards perfectibility. If you combine and if you connect yourself to the idea of the sacred, there's a great potential towards perfectibility. And by perfectibility I mean that the Islamic concept of ihsan. Ihsan means to be excellent. It means to achieve a certain kind of perfection. But ihsan also means to make things beautiful. And so when you are engaged with the sacred, you're always striving to reach the next rung, to reach the next level of perfectibility, the next level of beauty. So isn't having a multicolored manifestation better than a monocolor understanding of what the world is and should be? Engaging the sacred is a requirement for attaining perfectibility in our secular or profane world. When we lose the sense of the sacred, then we reach a state of jeopardy, of deep civilizational illusion. I hope that we are bold enough to press some of these philosophical frontiers and challenge the philosophical assumptions that we assume, whether in the humanities or the social sciences, to move further towards pluralism. Here are two underlying assumptions that I want to ventilate and share with you and perhaps explore further with regard to pluralism. Much of what we are talking about when we talk about pluralism is that we are talking about contending notions of liberalism. When we talk about pluralism, we talk about contending notions of liberalism, not a singular liberalism. That liberalism comes in different stripes. Often, toleration, which is a hallmark of Western liberalism, is premised on the idea that we can reach a rational consensus about the best way of life. That we can use reason, toleration, the idea of toleration, and I'll tell you who told us about toleration, that the idea of toleration means that we can come to a consensus and agreement based on reason of what is the best way of life. Both toleration and the search for rational consensus arose in the West because people were divided on what was the best way of life. Protestants against Catholics, people in between within those traditions too. And because there was no single way that everyone could agree on, Europeans then introduced the notion of toleration. Yet this has led to a paradox, because within liberal societies there is a persistent view that some people believe that their model is the single way for the best life. So within liberalism, there is one kind of liberalism that believes that this version of liberalism is the only way that you can go forward with, and that is the best life. This assumption is completely in contradiction to the idea of toleration. And this idea, let's call this idea that there's only one way to the best way of life, let's call that liberal universalism. And liberal universalism has limitations. We should ask the same question when talking about the religious norms on a global scale or in different contexts. When we talk about, say, I'm not going to talk about Malaysia because I don't know enough about Malaysia, but you can apply the things that I'm saying to Malaysian context. But you can think about, on a global scale, religious norms, that we're going to say that only this religious norm must apply on a global scale, or we're going to say that, in a particular context, only this norm is applicable. I think many of our international institutions, including the United Nations, hit the hard question when they push for a single, tolerant, liberal way of life. That is a problematic way to say there's only a single, tolerant, liberal way of life, even the UN. Yet this push is both paradoxical and antithetical to the real liberal ideal. There are two strategies for pushing the liberal agenda. On the one hand, you have the universal regime that I just told you earlier about universal liberalism that has been advocated by John Locke and Immanuel Kant, whose more recent followers include F.A. Hayek and later the work of John Rawls. Locke, for instance, believed that the best defense of toleration is that it enables us to discover the best way of life for humankind. So Locke believed that if you have toleration, you can then discover the best way of life for humankind. The other strategy, opposite to the one I just mentioned, is the one that was devised by Thomas Hobbes and David Hume. David Hume and Thomas Hobbes advocated liberal coexistence. So one is universal regime, that is the bad version of liberalism in my view, and then you have the good version of liberalism, what is called liberalism of coexistence. Their followers, that is Hobbes and Hume's followers today, or until recently, were people like Sir Isaiah Berlin and Michael Oakeshott. For Hobbes, toleration is the only strategy for peace. That when you have toleration, you can have peace. And this is a toleration that advocates a modus vivendi. And what is a modus vivendi? A modus vivendi is an arrangement or an agreement to allow conflicting parties to coexist peacefully. And so the idea of Isaiah Berlin and Michael Oakeshott and Hobbes and others was that you must have toleration as a strategy for peace. So if there are liberals around and they want peace, I would argue that you have to embrace liberalism of coexistence. But we just heard now, as the Mr. Johari said, that some people are against liberalism. And I think it's a mistake. If you want peace and you want coexistence, you might want to think about that again. I think that we need to go back to that notion of liberalism of coexistence and ask ourselves, what is the place of reason in human affairs? The imperfection of reason, because reason is not perfect, is what leads to the ideal of toleration. So how did toleration come about? Because we all agreed that we cannot, all of us don't reason the same way. And because we don't reason the same way, we have different ways of reasoning too. Because the reasoning is all often shaped culturally. Our cultural experiences shapes our reason. So we can have 4 extremely reasonable people in the room, and 4 of us will get 4 different opinions. And it's because we reason differently. Therefore, we develop the notion of tolerance and toleration. Because of reason's imperfection, you can open up the conversation, as people all over the world do, to share a concern with this imperfection. And this imperfection in reason is not only in the West, but is also in the East. Rational inquiry in norms, that is in values and so on, does not yield consensus on the best way of life. So when you have a rational conversation on what is the best way of life, you will never get a full consensus. You might get blocks of people agreeing to that, but not a full consensus. Rather, it shows that the best life comes in many varieties. That there's no one best life, but there are many varieties of the best life. In some of the European court's decisions, for instance, the recent decisions by the European Court on scarves and on developers in Turkey and so on, the judges and their philosophical tradition seem to assume that there's only one variety of the best life, and therefore they gave and handed down very, very narrow decisions that only takes the side of the government and doesn't take into consideration that Europe is different. There are multiple varieties of the best life in Europe. This assumption is also consistent with the underlying values of these judges. So these judges in the European Court, they took their understanding of reason and made that the test for everybody else. The absence here of a good mode of liberal toleration is problematic. So when judges hand down, at least for a very complex society, an answer that this is right, when these values, say for in the headscarf or something like that, is a highly contested issue, they're taking sides in saying that this is only the best way of life and not the other one. And I think, you could find that in Australia or in Malaysia or in South Africa, where I come from, that judges use their own experiences as a yardstick to address the complexity of a society that might be multicultural and multi-religious. So this idea of modus vivendi, in other words, to come to some kind of agreement when you are in disagreement about how you're going to deal with your disagreement, the idea of a modus vivendi accepts that there are many forms of life. Some
of the forms of life are yet to be contrived. We don't know what the best form of life will be tomorrow or 10 years from now. So they're always unfolding for us. That's why in Europe and North America, where there are so many different ways of life, we should be optimistic about these possibilities and recognize that no one life can be the best for everyone. The idea of a human good is too diverse. The idea that the question of the good, what Muslims call the ma'ruf, Muslims call the good ma'ruf, the idea that the ma'ruf or the good can be locked down into one version of what is the good. The idea of good is too diverse to be realized in one mode of life, in one form of life. Ma'ruf is way too complex, because you might go to one part of Malaysia and people think this is good. You can go to another part of Malaysia and people think something else is good. Within a religious community, you might have two understandings of the good or more. So the very idea of the good is way too complex and way too diverse to impose on people singularity. And therefore, so for the advocates of multiple kinds of human flourishing, pluralism is the ethical theory that underpins modus vivendi. One could say, for instance, that there are kinds of good lives that are neither better nor worse. Sometimes they are incommensurably valuable. In other words, they are incommensurably valuable because you cannot make them commensurable. A good example is monogamy and polygamy. Okay? They are valuable for some, but they are not commensurably valuable. They are incommensurably valuable, and different people pay different kinds of weight to each. In some modes of life, people wear the niqab. In other modes of life, people wear the hijab. And in others, people prefer to wear the miniskirt. These modes are different and incommensurable. But we cannot deny that either mode is worthy in itself. We cannot deny that for each person. So for instance, the people, women wearing niqab, they believe that this is a very valuable, covering their face is highly valuable. Others would say it's totally unacceptable, we prefer to wear the hijab. Others would say, well, modesty requires a light scarf over the head. And I can show my ears if you're a woman. And so on. These things are differently valuable because we cannot reach consensus on them, and because rationality cannot settle the question of their value. So within Islam, for instance, within Islam, on the question of women's veiling, women's hair, whole variety of issues, for instance, there is no universal consensus on any of these matters. People are divided upon that, even including religious scholars. So for instance, the scholar Muhammad Asad, who has a very important Quran that many people use and a great translation, in his view, for instance, the idea of covering the hair is not essential at all for a Muslim woman. Only in prayer it might be required. And so we need to begin to understand that that when I talk about this whole question of you know, when some people utilize a certain kind of mode of dress, say the miniskirt versus the hijab or the niqab, people are emphasizing different values. In utilizing the miniskirt, for instance, someone is emphasizing their right to exercise freedom above all. Where other people are saying, well, we're going to cover our hair, we're going to listen to tradition, or we're going to listen to religion, then they are giving obedience to tradition. So on the one hand, it is freedom. On the other hand, it is obedience to tradition. And so people make choices of what value in what instance they are going to prefer. And these issues are not soluble through reason, and they're not soluble either through religion. And therefore, Islam, for instance, builds in this notion of plurality. So for instance, in Muslim legal theory, which is moral philosophy, for instance, there are two schools of thought on some of the questions of the moral truth. And some believe that there's only a singular moral truth, and others believe that there are multiple moral truths, and that we cannot decide on the singularity and one can never know what is the truth. And therefore Muslims have developed an understanding that says, al-mujtahidu idha ijtahada fa-asab falahu ajran wa in akhta falahu ajrun wahid. That someone, an intellectual, a jurist, a scholar, who deliberates and emphasizes and put energy into thinking through a complex issue, If they make that effort and they get it right, they get 2 rewards, and if they get it wrong, they get 1 reward. In other words, the intellectual effort, when you put in intellectual effort, you can come up with multiple answers, including wrong answers, but you will never know the wrong answers in this world. Only God knows the right answer. And hence, that is called the infallibilist position in Islamic moral theory, and therefore it is open a certain kind of pluralism. So I favor value pluralism, and there is, and we affirm that each side has access to moral knowledge. This requires giving up the notion of the truth of norms or of ethical truth. That requires a whole new shift, that there's a singular truth of norms or there's one ethical truth. There's no longer that possible. To allow that the good becomes plural is to allow the potential for conflict, and therefore there is no one solution to such conflicts. So when you do say, for instance, that the good is multiple, then you do open up a potential for multiple goods contesting each other. And there's a conflict. But again, you don't have one solution for these conflicts. So we face hard questions, for instance, on questions of sexual choice, monogamy and polygamy, serial polygamy. How do we adjudicate on these issues? Parda, niqab, absolute personal liberties, blasphemy to some, freedom of speech for other, modesty questions. How do we reconcile these kinds of viable claims? To say that values are incommensurable is not to say that all ways of life have equal value. To value pluralism is to argue that there is a diversity of goods and a diversity of evils. Different ways of life can more or less find their own ways of achieving universal goods, of mitigating universal evils and resolving conflicts among them. And we are now, for instance, in this day and age, facing in this biopolitical stage of global politics, the tyranny of the singular. And so when you have those multiple goods, you must find a way, a modus vivendi, that you will never agree on what are the multiple goods, but therefore we need to agree to disagree, and therefore we have what we call a modus vivendi. And this is an idea that I take from the moral philosopher and political theorist John Gray. Muslims thinkers in the past, for instance, like Al-Ghazali, who dies in 1111, for instance, have helped us a great deal in thinking through this question about interpretation and how does one interpret, text that teaches us morality and moral values. One of the things that Ghazali says in a very important book called Qanun al-Ta'wil, that is the canon of interpretation, he gives you many, many passages, difficult passages from the Quran and prophetic tradition that might on the surface of it look very difficult and very problematic. Ghazali works through all that, and he comes and provides for us a very, very eloquent and a very, very helpful triangle that if we utilize a triangle in terms of our intellectual work, we might be able to go quite a way in the way of pursuing and furthering the idea of plural interpretations and plural ways of understanding the good. So the triangle that Ghazali identifies is that there must be intention. So the first point he says, don't refute reason. That's point number one. Don't reject reason, don't refute reason. Without reason, you cannot have any conversation, a meaningful conversation. The second point he says, bear in mind when you're interpreting, he says, that you don't claim and never claim to know all. Always know that what you know today is what is your intellectual harvest today, that tomorrow it might change, and that you in your capacity might not be able to encompass all. So don't show some intellectual humility, that knowledge is endless and understanding is endless. So don't refute reason, and you don't know all, that must be intention. And the third angle of the tension is that when you have multiplicity of interpretations, don't only hang on to one and to the exclusion of all the others. To be open to the possibility that this is my interpretation, but it is possible that you can arrive at another one. When you have that, you keep that intention. Isn't that a very eloquent way of dealing with this? That don't refute reason, that you don't claim to know all, and that one always thinks about that the point or the piece that I hold on to is the piece that the way I understood it, and all the other pieces might also be equally valuable. To make pluralism possible, we need an ethics of accountability. To make pluralism possible, and when societies go through transitions, moving away from despotism, from autocratic rule, to pluralistic democracy, you need an ethics of accountability, you need a liberalism of coexistence, we also need a regime of reconciliation. You need to be able to reconcile between people that are at loggerheads with each other. And that is what I'm going to say in the next part of my presentation, and spend a bit of time on the ethics of accountability. Most, if not almost, all ethical communities and systems of moral reasoning, they all recognize some notion of responsibility and accountability. And ethics of responsibility is not only the burden to be shouldered by an individual, and this is very important, that ethics of responsibility starts with the individual, but I'm beginning to argue that in the globalizing world, and we now have different kinds of globalization, that I believe that beyond the law, larger collectivities, especially nations and countries, ought to be held accountable for their actions as part of an ethic of responsibility. So you cannot let certain countries get off and run away and say, you know, because we are powerful, we can do so. We also now need an ethics of responsibility that we hold larger entities responsible. And today we are living in a world that the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai talks about, that we had two kinds of globalization. The one kind of globalization that we had was called vertebral globalization. Vertebral globalization is the one in which the like the backbone, its vertebral is all connected, and there's a central nervous system, and there's central messaging. But he believes that that kind of globalization is something of the past. The new kind of globalization is what he calls cellular globalization. Cellular globalization happens, what many of you are doing right now, sending WhatsApp, sending messages to different people, sending emails, making notes. It goes on to your various devices. It happens without central messaging. People are making connections without any central backbone. You have friends in Latin America, you have networks that are no longer predictable, and that's called cellular globalization. And so what is happening is that in this environment of cellular globalization, it's a different kind of a ball game, and we need to think about, and in fact, I believe that the very nature of cellular globalization creates the possibility for pluralism in ways that we never had it before. And there's no way that you can even manage that pluralism. So you might as well begin to recognize it, and once we recognize it, we can also talk about it, and we can also then, by talking about it, there's accountability and responsibility. So you don't let kids or militants, or prevent them, sending messages to chat rooms to talk about where their next bombing exercise is going to be, what they're going to destroy next. So once you have this kind of accountability within cellular globalization, then people in those chat rooms will report them and identify the wrongdoers. And therefore, if you have an ethics of accountability that can penetrate cellular globalization, you're going in the right direction. But you must espouse, in order to get there, in order to securitize cellular globalization, you must admit to pluralism, to variety. You must allow people to be able to engage in cellular globalization, so that you can also there then be able to police it, so that it does not become damaging and threatening to humanity. And today, we are all threatened by global warming and ecological threats. And this is the point that I'm making, that, not individuals, but also larger entities and communities and nations and states are accountable. Global warming teaches us, and we have now an awareness of global warming like never ever before, that we must share responsibility, and there must be collective accountability as stewards of the globe. One country cannot put out all the greenhouse gases to destroy the forests of Latin America or Africa. We cannot do that anymore, and hence, again, in order to have a globalized world, in order to have a pluralistic way of life, we must, as a matter of necessity, also create a means of shared responsibility and collective accountability. Now, Sufis and mystics have an arresting way of explaining complex themes, complex issues, with their successful use of imagery. And they use this imagery and parables in order to drive home the point. And I'm going to make this next point to begin to think about and work with you on this question of how one can think about the question of what can one achieve if we are accountable and if we are responsible. Jalaluddin Rumi, who died in 1273, the great mystic, reminded us to be aware of those who obfuscate reality and urge us not to be intimidated. And Rumi urges us to not be intimidated by our own fears. No matter how large and dreaded the challenge, human beings do have the ability to overcome and conquer. But if we do not confront the challenge, that indeed the problem will metastasize. Rumi uses the parable of the snake. A snake is known for its deadly venom in most cases. But something more happens if the snake is not confronted, Rumi says. I quote Rumi. Rumi says, "It is said that when a snake does not see a human being for 40 years, it turns into a dragon. That is, it sees no one who would cause its evil and vileness to melt." I'm still quoting Rumi. A big lock indicates that there is something valuable and costly inside the place where the serpent is guarding. There's something valuable behind it. The great obfuscation, the better the essence, the better the essence. The more the obfuscation, the better the essence. Like a serpent guarding a treasure trove. Don't look at the ugliness of the serpent. Look at the value of the treasure. End of quote. Now, this is a fairly complex parable that Rumi has sketched for us. Let me try and unpack it. One moral from Rumi's multivalent uses of parables can be the following reading that I would provide. If one does not confront a problem, then a venomous but comparatively harmless snake can turn into a dragon to become a bigger problem. For Rumi, the serpent or the snake is a metaphor for the animal soul or the lower soul, the animal soul, the lower self. If this self that often covets everything is left unrestrained, then it will turn into a dragon. Hence Rumi says, the inner workings of the human being, the inner dimensions of the human being, is predisposed to go out of control and therefore requires constant vigilance and regulation. Since no human being confronted the snake for 40 years, namely did not confront the lower self to curb it of its vileness, it turned into something more grotesque, into a dragon. Now the human being will need a rare talent in order to combat the menacing dragon. Instead of needing the elementary skills of being a snake charmer, now you need to have the strength and you need to have the Herculean task of becoming a dragon slayer. Yet it is worth killing the snake or the dragon, Rumi says, for the dividends are rich. Often in Rumi's stories, the serpent guards a precious treasure of emeralds that are often found in ruined buildings and homes. You know, people flee or leave and the house is in ruins and there's always serpents there, but behind the serpent there are huge treasures of emeralds and valuable jewelry. Those emeralds are the gems that make a human being, and for Rumi those emeralds are the capacity to love. And this is the essence of the human being, the capacity to love. Of course, the treasure in every instance could be different, and thus it is situational. When Rumi is applied to our context, then the dragon guards the treasure of love or the treasure of coexistence. With love comes responsibility, and for 21st century people of all faiths, Muslims and Jews and Christians and Buddhists and Hindus and others, there is nothing greater than the question of responsibility and accountability. And if it means that in order to acquire responsibility, one has to be exposed to some risk, like you're going to kill the dragon, you're going to be the dragon slayer or the killer of the serpent, then the Rumi encourages us to make that leap and to be courageous and become the dragon slayers in order to unleash the potential of love and its consequences that human beings can benefit from. Instead of being intimidated by the ferocity of the snake turned dragon, he encourages us to value the treasure. If people are derelict in their responsibilities, then the Muslim tradition treats such disregard of duty to be the equivalent of the Day of Judgment. In a famous tradition, the Prophet Muhammad said, إِذَا ضُيِّعَتِ الْأَمَانَةُ فَانْتَظِرُوا السَّاعَةَ, that when responsibility, amana, is destroyed, then surely expect the hour of judgment. When he was asked, how can responsibility be, he provided a devastating but insightful explanation. Responsibility implied be nearly destroyed. Responsibility doesn't get night. Responsibility is much more complex and robust. Responsibility is established through elaborate processes of institutions and networks of trust, obligations and responsibilities. It's a complex thing. All these things must hang together for responsibility to work in communities and societies and so on. And human beings are responsible and accountable for what they do. Hence, in reply to the question, how responsibility is destroyed, the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, replied, when matters are entrusted to the incompetent, then expect the hour. This responsibility begins with competence. So often, when we find ourselves in narrow straits, when we find ourselves against the wall, when people go for despotism and for authoritarian options and for non-pluralistic ways of life, you do know that a massive incompetence has preceded this. And therefore, you need to watch to see that when responsibility is destroyed, you need to see what kind of competence has gone in. If there's competence, responsibility will stay. Responsibility and accountability will create and innovate possibilities. But when you have incompetence, the entire infrastructure is destroyed, and soon you will have nothing except brute power. So could, in an effort to sustain a liberalism of coexistence that I talked about earlier, can one have a liberalism of coexistence without accountability and responsibility? In my view, no. And since I said that this is not only happens at a national level, but this also happens at the global level, I want to argue that there should be today in our world a global solidarity of responsible people and the alliances of competent people. Even if one is agnostic about Western governments in their conduct, especially toward Muslim majority countries and the Muslim world, one must ensure that the alliances and solidarities in America and Europe's civil societies will be rooted in an ethic of responsibility, preceded by trust and competence. So if governments in Western Europe and North America are incompetent and doing irresponsible things, I believe one must have solidarity with the civil societies of Europe and North America, where people are much more effective and are much more interested in having a safe world for themselves. It is at that level that individuals and communities will identify their interests in global solidarity and begin their reconciliation with communities and individuals of their choice on a global scale. Already thousands of courageous Americans and Europeans are engaged in self-questioning their countries' imperial and unethical global postures, and therefore we can think now, if people from this part of the world also in their movement and mobilization of civil society move out to create global solidarity, that will lead to the greater good, and that will lead to, again, to a coexistence of liberalism or a certain kind of coexistence. Similarly, citizens of Muslim majority countries and those living in minority contexts can earnestly engage in a reconciliation processes with citizens elsewhere in the world. Surely in a world of cellular globalization, relationships of trust and responsibility at a people-to-people level would prove to be a giant step in the right direction. Muslims located in countries like India, Nigeria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, South Africa, the United States and Israel, for instance, could take the lead. Often these are deeply divided societies and are in dire need for reconciliation. Here Muslims of goodwill, but also Hindus and Buddhists, Christians and others, can become key role players in cellular globalization for the good, rather than cellular globalization in pursuit of nefarious ends of terror that the foot soldiers of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria so earnestly pursue. Reconciliation demands a radical reconciliation, and if you want to do a liberalism and pluralism of coexistence in a serious way, it demands a radical posture of self-critique. It begins with self-critique. And those of us living in different parts of the world, especially those of us like people like myself living in North America, we might have to engage in even a more rigorous self-scrutiny. Self-critique can begin with the longer memory of the past in mind or a more immediate context. Take, for instance, I'll just give you one example. Take the attitude of the West, and with America in the lead, insisting that the nations of the global South disarm and get rid of nuclear weapons, especially there's a whole focus on Iran and North Korea. In the streets of different parts of the global South, this demand of the West is met with by many people with a certain amount of dismay and great questioning. They range from the questions such as, is the US not the owner of the largest stockpile of the most advanced weapons of mass destruction? Was the US not the first country in human history to use a devastating atomic bomb to kill thousands of civilians, not combatants, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Furthermore, the US frequently tries to undermine the most effective international instrument to combat global political violence done by governments, namely the International Criminal Court of Justice, formed to prosecute dictators and international terrorists for war crimes. In other words, if one returns to Rumi's parable, then surely even nations are like serpents who have morphed into dragons and are out of control. We need to slay dangerous dragons through argument. Of course, I'm not asking you to be violent, but through argument and through moral discussion. Reconciliation does not only involve the need to identify the causes of moral and political harm, but it must simultaneously involve self-correction, self-improvement, and social reform. Muslim countries, especially at the level of individual, community, and society, will have to take the lead in changing their own conditions. Such change begins with governance, in the first instance. The lack of good and responsible governance creates a growing pool of disgruntled and frustrated people in Muslim societies whose futures are bleak, if not non-existent. I just read in this morning's paper that you, Malaysia, you have the honor of providing a second Malaysian as a suicide bomber for ISIS. These people, of young people, these pools of young people become the incubators for radicalism that morphs into frightening swamps of militancy and terror. In several Muslim countries, attention will have to be given to the next point, the treatment of religious minorities. Platitudes will not be sufficient. Discriminatory laws and practices that make non-Muslim minorities into effective second-class citizens in countries like Pakistan, Egypt, I don't know what the situation of minorities is in Malaysia, so I won't comment, you can tell me better. Iran and Saudi Arabia, to mention a few, but a few are intolerable the way the practices go. Ordinary citizens, it is the duty of ordinary citizens who are sitting here, will have to be empowered in order to show zero tolerance for autocratic regimes and discriminatory treatment. But such change can only take place if people in those very societies promote transformation according to their own values and standards. And liberal coexistence or pluralism must strive to get the best out of people working with their local cultures. So I'm almost sure that if you look into Malay culture, into Chinese culture, into Indian culture, in a country like this, you will find resources for pluralism. You will find resources for liberal coexistence. Many Muslim countries might have to consider establishing truth and reconciliation tribunals, like South Africa, in order to come to grips with atrocities of the past, acts of genocide and massacres undertaken by governments and military rulers and political kleptocrats and political autocrats. The disclosure of past atrocities might be sufficient and more healing rather than Nuremberg-style justice for offenders, so that you don't create further division. So I'm arguing that when you have reconciliation, you do it a la South Africa, where the people who have done wrong must confess to their wrong, own up and do disclosures, and then that will be a certain kind of, provide them some kind of amnesty. Because if you're going to further prosecute those people, and then you're going to have tribunals after tribunal a la Nuremberg, it could be divisive. But you must take it very seriously. At least that's my point of view. These kinds of procedures will set the gold standard for accountable governance, so that future rulers can be held responsible for their deeds. Let me conclude to say that in the Islamic tradition, this idea of being creative and finding resources from within human societies from multiple places has a beautiful parable in the Quran. The Quran says that وَأَوْحَى رَبُّكَ إِلَى النَّحْلِ أَنِ اتَّخِذِي مِنَ الْجِبَالِ بُيُوتًا وَمِنَ الشَّجَرِ وَمِمَّا يَعْرِشُونَ ثُمَّ كُلِي مِنْ كُلِّ الثَّمَرَاتِ فاسلكي سبل ربك ذللا يخرج من بطونها شراب مختلف ألوانه فيه شفاء للناس إن في ذلك لآية لقوم يتفكرون. That your Lord inspired the bee and told the bee that it must make a home in every tree and in every mountain and every trellis. And then it told the bee that go out and collect from all the fruits. Fasluki subala rabbiki dhulala, and then walk humbly in the path of your Lord. And then the verse says that comes out from the belly of the bee a beverage of multiple colors and hues, and then it says in it there is a remedy for humanity. Indeed, this parable, it says, is a sign for people who wish to think. And this is important, that the honeybee has to take from the diversity to create something new. Everyone works hard, like every worker bee works hard and creates the possibility. And then is the fruit. Many people think that the fruit or the remedy, that the honey is a remedy, is basically all the virtues of honey, how good honey is. Sure, that is important, but it has another meaning. That in this kind of action, where multiple people, different people work together, take from different places to make something new, this effort of a plurality of humanity working together to create something new, that is the remedy. That kind of working, that kind of making of society, of differences that are held together to produce something extraordinary, that is the remedy. That is the shifa that the verse is pointing to. And this requires a people who think. I thank you very much for your patience. I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think I would like to open the floor for discussion. I'll just take 3 questions first. Introduce yourself and you can direct the question to Prof. Thank you. Can you take the
Okay, the minister was asked this morning in the Senate about the insults to Islam. This is what he replied. The teachings of liberalism and pluralism are seen as among the most prevalent forms of insult to Islam recently. And he says he has identified, although he has not identified, he said the government has identified the forms of insult based on reports by the Islamic bodies. However, he did not state how many cases of insult were attributed to such teaching. So I would like to hear what your views are of Professor Musa.
Hi, Prof. I'm Chin Huat from Penang Institute. You reminded us that the idea of good is too complex to be singular. The idea of good life is too complex to be singular, but I think often people who preach singularity of what is good and so on do so for extrinsic reason. For example, views of what is good, then you cannot have unity, communal unity, against the others. I think that's really the problem in Malaysia here. That the whole idea that why you need a single interpretations of Islam, as YB Zahirul pointed out earlier, is the fear that Islam is being threatened, Muslims are being threatened by non-Muslims, even though that the percentage of Muslims is now above 60%. So how do you deal with that kind of fear, that kind of insecurity, victimhood, that the under siege mentality? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mustafa Jamaboy, I have a question. You know, every religion, I mean, you have mentioned about the understanding and so on and so forth, the pluralism, the issue of the honeybees and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, each religion goes and says that it has to, for that matter, that I am the way. This is the only way. In spite of all the what YB stated at the very beginning, which he quoted the ayat from the Quran, which is very correct. Nevertheless, the Quran does say very clearly, say not Trinity, desist. Shirk, have no other gods besides me. The Old Testament says, I am a jealous God. Thou shalt not have any other gods besides me. Christ comes along and says, this is the way, I am the way. So, all religions do have this sort of exclusivity preached by their messengers, which contradicts what YB and what our honorable guest had to say this evening. Can you reconcile this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. These are three very important and exciting questions. I need to think whether I want to come back to Malaysia or not, and depending how I'm going to answer the questions. Let me think. I haven't been to several cities. I haven't been to Johor Bahru. I haven't been to Langkawi. I want to come back again, so I'm going to be nice to the minister. No, I'm going to be honest with the minister. I don't know under... You quoted me the report. I didn't see the minister's reasoning behind it and so on. But it does seem to me that it is lacking in a certain kind of clarity. I need to know more about what he means by liberalism and you know, the kinds of things that you quoted there. I don't remember the entire phrase because there was a communications deficit there. But from what I understand from my friends, that has been going on about liberalism and what's the other thing that people have been condemning here? pluralism and so on. Yes. It's clear that there's some particular meaning what they mean by pluralism, liberalism, and I think it's very different from the stuff that I'm talking about. And so I think we're talking about apples and oranges. I'm talking about apples, they're talking about oranges or maybe lemons. Something very, very unpalatable for them. I think it requires a very careful examination and a much more enlightened conversation. I think that in a society, the very idea that Malaysia has accepted, constitutionally and otherwise, the plurality of communities, religious communities, ethnic communities, is already on the way to liberalism. You're already on a certain kind of liberalism. It might not be the optimal one, but it's already there. If you want to get away from liberalism, you need to tear up the Malaysian constitution and begin knocking down the foundations of what the society is about. So I don't know what these people are, what these representatives are talking about. These are, I mean, I know, for instance, the founders of this country were educated in the United Kingdom. They came from Oxford and Cambridge. They had liberal education at the heart of it. You inherited a British foundation of the order here. Questions of rights is liberal. These are liberal rights we are talking about. So I don't know what they are talking about. This is, I think, the first thing that we done, that many of those spokespersons who are saying these things need a quick lesson in Malaysian history. And Malaysian History 101 to refamiliarize themselves with the foundations of the society. And then we can have a grown-up conversation. Right now, this is not a grown-up conversation. So I'm looking forward to coming back and having a grown-up conversation on the question of liberalism and pluralism. But I've started the conversation on pluralism. Insecurity. So the question is, why are Muslims the only people that are insecure? That's the first question we need to ask. Muslims are 1.2 billion people in the world. Some people say 1.4 billion. They are global, they have enormous wealth. They are the greatest controllers of oil and other kinds of resources. What is there to be insecure about? And that insecurity can be remedied in a number of ways. The quick fix is to, and there'll be a big future for a lot of shrinks, psychological treatment. But that's not what I mean. That is a joke. Okay? No, that's a quick fix. But the most serious thing is that you only become insecure when you are ignorant about yourself, and you lack confidence in your tradition and your history and your values. So the remedy to insecurity is greater self-knowledge. And oftentimes people think that knowing elementary religion is self-knowledge. Elementary religion and practicing religion is not self-knowledge. It's a set of rituals. It's beginning to understand the meaning of those rituals. To understand your relationship with God and you understand relationship with the cosmos. And to begin to understand your finitude in relation to this great infinity of possibilities, that you begin to develop an understanding of security. So oftentimes I think that this insecurity is self-constructed. It is sometimes this insecurity is told to people by politicians over and over and again to win vote banks. And this not only happens here, it happens in a variety of countries and so on. Christians do it elsewhere. You know, in the United States, where I come from, I mean, evangelicals and the Tea Party say that to Christians all the time and drive them in droves into the arms of certain kind of politicians and tell them the Muslims are coming. Telling them, you know, the blacks are going to take over the country. The Latinos are now the new threat. Okay, in America. So this kind of scare tactics is something that happens all the time. But that is the way, because the insecurity is that those communities are not properly edified. They're not educated, and they're not told that, you know, self-understanding is lacking. And so therefore the quick fixes are this, that is the kinds of, sloganizing and demonizing the others are the quick fixes. And the people who do that are actually doing those communities no good service. It's actually destroying those communities in the long term. Because the long-term remedy is to establish deep confidence within those societies. And they know who they are and what they are. And people can be, Muslims and others can be very strong in their own traditions, provided they understand their traditions in the best way. There's a bad way of understanding Islam, and there's a good way of understanding Islam. Every religion is like that. There is the Al-Qaeda version of Islam, the ISIS version of Islam, that believes in destroying people. And then there's the Rumi version of Islam, and then there's the Ibn Arabi version of Islam. Ibn Arabi would say things like, لَقَدْ صَارَ قَلْبِ قَابِلًا كُلَّ صُورَةٍ فَمَرْأَ لِغِزْلَانٍ وَدَيْرٌ لِرُهْبَانٍ وَبَيْتٌ لِأَوْثَانٍ وَكَعْبَةُ طَائِفٍ وَأَلْوَاحُ تَوْرَاتٍ وَمُصْحَفُ قُرْآنٍ أدين بدين الحب أين توجهت ركائبه فالحب ديني وإيماني. My heart is a receptacle for every form. My heart is a receptacle for every possibility. It is the pasture for gazelles. It is a monastery for the monk. It is a temple for the idolater. It is the pilgrim's Kaaba. It is a place where the pages of the Torah and the scrolls of the Quran finds a place. I confess the religion of love wherever its caravan takes me, for love is my religion and my faith. That is another version of Islam that your maybe religious leaders don't tell you about. That's another version of Islam that makes you supremely confident that all the beauty and diversity of religious faith can be accommodated and understood through the meaning of love. And that takes me to the gentleman's question about the exclusivity. The exclusivity, each religion comes within a historical framework and time and addresses some problems. So therefore it formulates its dogma in some kind of exclusive ways. But within those exclusive ways of articulating, there are also possibilities of plurality. Now when you put them over gazillions of years together over time, and then now they live side by side, you have Buddhism living next to Hinduism, living next to Jainism, next to Judaism and Christian Islam. You're talking about thousands of years. We're not talking about 1400 years of Islam. We're talking about many, many thousands of years. Now these religions and traditions have morphed, but now they've all also discovered within themselves the possibility of plurality. So while they make exclusive claims in terms of dogma, they also have within them notions and possibilities, teachings that tell them all about respecting your neighbor, the dignity of humanity. So no matter what kind of Judaism you have, that Judaism believes in the chosen of the Jewish people and all the others are goyim, even in that tradition, the dignity of all humanity is taught. In Islam, the dignity, in Hinduism, that has its entire caste system, still there are possibilities of talking about the dignity. So I think that there are overlapping developments within these religious traditions. When read superficially, they might see very antithetical and paradoxical. But if those adherents work hard at those traditions, and those traditions do not have to be the same as they were developed on day one, they evolve over time within themselves, they can arrive at notions of coexistence and possibility. So that's how I would address your dilemma in itself. So yes, so people, Muslims and Christians will disagree on how they think about Jesus, but those don't become insurmountable differences. They still have to show charity to each other. They must still show love to each other. And that question about how they conceive of Jesus, one sees of Jesus as a prophet, the other sees Jesus as incarnation of the divine, that's something they will keep on talking about. And that's what they're supposed to do. They need to keep on talking about those things, not fighting. And they need to discourse with each other. And the Quran says, at least the tradition I know, وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ, and engage people with that which is beautiful, in conversation that is beautiful, not shooting them down and insulting them and doing detrimental things. I'm appalled by Muslim preachers who are imported from South Africa and from India and so on, who come do anti-Christian preaching, and insult the Bible and insult Christians and so on. That is not what Islam taught. And I'm appalled by the number of Muslims who go and listen to them. I'm appalled. You ought to have better sense not to subject yourself to that kind of ridicule. Okay? So I think that's, and I'm glad to know that in Malaysia some of those elements are banned. They don't have to come here. I don't think you should ban them. The people of Malaysia should just not go to their meetings. Let them sit alone on the stage. That's what should be happening. I don't think banning works. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah. Any two questions? One.
Hi, my name is Mustaqim from KL. I have a bit of a problem with toleration, because I think I see there's a limit to toleration. So when we the way I understand the verse lita'arafu, get to know each other, toleration won't be enough. You have to won't be enough. You have to appreciate. I think in this country, in particular in Malaysia, for instance, we've been talking about toleration, but we get nowhere. Instead, in fact, we are regressing. For long, Muslims and non-Muslim have been living with each other, but we don't appreciate the culture of others. We tolerate. We say we tolerate, but at this point at this point of time now, I mean, there are a lot of issues come to the surface. Thanks.
Next one, please. Anyone? No. Okay, Prof. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, just to follow up on that question. I think part of the reason that why people feel insecure in Malaysia is that the fear of apathecy, that you would leave your religion if you accept diversity. And that goes down to the fact that in our constitution, the majority group, the Malays, are by definition, by constitutional definition, Muslim. And the religious authorities fear that, you know, if you allow different views, pluralisms, and then it leads to the deconstructions of the ethnic majority. So we'd like to have your view on religious freedom for Muslim. Thank you.
Yeah, one more.
Yeah, I'd like fatwa and so on from a Khalif.
Thank you very much. The speaker who asked about toleration, I want to clarify, I was not advocating tolerance. What I was citing in the first part of my presentation was the idea of British political philosophers, the idea of toleration. Hobbes and Locke and others talked about the idea of toleration because we cannot agree on reason and we cannot come to a rational consensus. Therefore, the idea of toleration. So toleration is slightly different from the idea of what we call today tolerance. That's more of a philosophical idea that what then creates the possibility for toleration, that you must now have multiple consensus that exist. But I'm with you totally that the idea of tolerance is a bad idea. Because the idea of tolerance that I only tolerate you while I am powerless, but once I become empowered, I will overpower you. So that the idea of tolerance that we throw about is a very weak idea. I'm with you that we need something that has greater legs. And you have gone in the right direction to say that we need to appreciate, in other words, what I understand by that, if I can put a gloss on that, is that what you're saying that we need to appreciation through learning and through experiencing and through knowing well what the other traditions are all about, so that we can find overlapping meanings in what. So for instance, Christians have love, Muslims have love, there's charity, there's notions of generosity and so on. It's only that you begin to know Christians, or you know Hindus or Sikhs or other traditions and so on, then you begin to understand what's going on. Once you know people's traditions and you start talking to them, you're beginning to understand yourself and you understand the other. That is the way that we come to know each other. It's just not through academic learning, but also through coexistence, meaningful coexistence. I always say that it must be the case in multicultural societies that people should be visiting each other's sacred places on the big holidays. Now, I'm sure there are some people going to say, you know, all the Hindus and Christians can come to the Muslims, and Muslims can't go to the Sikh Gurdwara, or they can't go. I'm sure there are people who are going to say that. But just imagine you are in Australia and not in Malaysia. I'm speaking in Australia right now, where there might be sensible people that I can talk to. And they might hear me without the kind of, you know, governmental lenses that will say this or that, or some kind of theologians doing it. But in the United States, I'm encouraging Muslims do that. They invite on their holidays Christians for a celebration, Jews to a celebration, Hindus to a celebration on the holidays. That's how people come to know each other. And that should be reciprocated. I remember very well that about 2 decades ago, you know the country called Sudan? Sudan is a big majority Muslims. There are also Christians and people of other traditions there. The people from the south of Sudan came, and they came to South Africa, and we welcomed that delegation in a mosque. The Christian Sudanese was in tears. He said, I've lived in Sudan all my life. I've never been in the inside of a mosque. It's a shameful experience that the society's mosque doors are not open to other people. This is how you come to know. And you sit with others, and you break bread. And you break bread. And you come to learn each other. That's how it happens. So I'm with you on, and there are examples in the Islamic tradition of collaboration. The Prophet Muhammad, before he announced prophecy, when he was in Mecca, he was involved in what we would today call an NGO kind of activity, known as the Pledge of the Virtuous, the Hilful Fudul, where they engaged in helping the poor. And he was collaborating with people who were polytheists, people of faith that is antithetical to monotheism. He did it. Not only did he do it, when he announced prophecies in Medina, he happily recalled back that time when he was that kind of activist, and he said, if it happens today, I'll be part of that again. I wish I can do that. And he didn't say, oh, I'm not going to work with the mushrikeen, with the polytheists. He said, if it happens, if that kind of opportunity arises again, I'll be part of that. So it's only through collaboration and working in common solidarity and common causes that we come to know and appreciate each other, as you said it. And that is genuine pluralism. That will be pluralism in action. The question of, the follow-up to the insecurity question, apostasy, and people will leave religions and so on. I think that's an unfounded fear. I mean, maybe there's something in the Malay DNA that they are predisposed to apostasy, but in other countries, people are not. You know, in Egypt, in other countries where there are Christians, people are. I mean, Muslims are not becoming Christians or Jews or Buddhists or Hindus in their droves. India is a great example. Magnificent example. Nothing happens. So maybe this is a issue that is either manufactured, but it has no reason, it has no legs in reason. It might be some kind of myth or superstition, and I wish to argue with you, and I'm sure you don't hold that view. You're just the messenger. Yeah. No, because if you held that view, I would like to argue with you. Why are you saying that? So I think there's something. I mean, I think it's deeply offensive to such people to say that people will convert. On what grounds will they convert? I mean, you know, the British and Christian missionaries tried to convert people in India. We would call them rice Christians and so on. That didn't give enormous disruption and so on. And I think that if you close the doors to people, they'll become more curious of what is elsewhere, and they might find something attractive, and then they will really genuinely convert. So I think that it doesn't have any ground in reason, to my knowledge, and it's also not have any ground in Islamic teachings. You cannot la ikraha fi din. There's no compulsion in matters of religion. You cannot box people in. People need to be able to make choices. I mean, the individuals, I mean, true faith is when you have the freedom to choose, not the coercion to choose. Not coerced to choose. That is no choice. That is coercion. So, yeah. You know, the question about the Jafari school. And Jafari school is one of a number of schools. Is a school of, for those of you who don't know, is a school of thought that people, there are two major theological creeds in Islam, the Sunni creed and the Shia creed. And each one of them also different from within. But the Jafari school is the law school that people of the Shia tradition accept. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether there's greater tolerance or lesser tolerance. All of these schools teach tolerance, these diversity. The tolerance doesn't really, you know, come from the law schools. The law schools tell you about the do's and don'ts of practical matters. There are theologies that have developed in all the law, that some of these law schools adhere to, theologies that develop. Theologies of exclusivism. Theologies of very strong exclusivism, that a believer shall not be killed for killing an unbeliever. And these were theologies developed when Islam was an empire. And it's the imperial mentality that also works its way into religious teachings. And so one of the things why religion continuously gets renewed, and Islam, the idea of the renewal of the faith, the question of ijtihad and tajdeed, renewal and continuous intellectual effort, is precisely this. And in Islam there's also a providential teaching to it, that God will send, or God expects at the beginning of every 100 years, that people will come to renew the faith. With every 100 years, in other words, time changes practices, and these practices need to be updated. And so these, in the theology of democracy, is different from a theology of empire. And therefore that kind of teachings about exclusivism and so on, most Muslims don't really know about it, or when they do come to know about it, they really feel really, oppressed by it, because that doesn't seem to be very equal and fair. But it's available in some of the textbooks, and some people do advocate it. And so you're going to find in ISIS, for instance, ISIS's caliphate and so on, where they're going to do crazy things, that the first thing they do is they want to make non-Muslims into medieval notions of minorities, and they want to tax them the jizya and call them dhimmis. So this is, but that is the kind of to educate